$1 million. For decades, that number was shorthand for made it. The word millionaire used to conjure yachts and mansions. But here's the truth, nobody wants to admit in 2026. $1 million in net worth in Australia today might not feel like wealth at all. It might just feel like normal. Today we're breaking down what actually happens once your net worth crosses 7 figures in this country. What changes, what doesn't, and why so many Australians hit this number and still feel like they're just getting by. Let's start with how common this actually is, because the answer might surprise you. The average Australian household net worth sits at roughly $1.66 million as of mid-2025. Read that again. The average household in this country is already above the $1 million mark, but averages lie because that number gets dragged upward by a relatively small group of very wealthy households. The median tells a far more honest story. For households aged 41 to 64, median net worth sits around $809,000. For those over 65, it's about $817,000. So crossing $1 million in net worth, particularly before retirement age, still puts you meaningfully ahead of the typical Australian household, even if it doesn't feel that way on a random Tuesday. Here's the first thing that surprises almost everyone who reaches this number. It rarely happens through a single big win. Nobody wakes up a millionaire. It happens gradually, invisibly, through decades of a home slowly gaining equity, a super balance compounding quietly in the background, and maybe some shares or an investment property doing the same. And because it happens so slowly, most people don't actually notice the moment they cross the threshold. They just keep going about their lives. And one day, an accountant or a Google search tells them what their numbers now add up to. So let's break down what $1 million in net worth actually looks like in practice. Because just like the $500,000 million arc, this number hides 3 very different financial realities underneath it. Version 1, the property-heavy millionaire. This is the most common version in Australia, and it's a direct result of how this country's wealth is structured. Roughly 70% of average household net worth sits in property. So picture a family home worth $1.3 million with $400,000 remaining on the mortgage. That's $900,000 in equity right there. And add a modest super balance of $150,000 or so, and you've crossed the $1 million line. But here's the catch that trips people up every single time. That $1 million is almost entirely frozen. It doesn't generate cash flow. It doesn't pay for groceries. This household might genuinely be stretched week to week, servicing a mortgage on a property that's worth a fortune on paper while feeling nowhere near rich in daily life. Version 2, the diversified millionaire. This person has built their million differently. Maybe $400,000 in home equity, $350,000 in superannuation, and $250,000 spread across shares, ETFs, or an investment property. This version behaves completely differently to version 1 because a meaningful chunk of that wealth is either liquid or actively generating income. If $250,000 of that is invested in dividend-paying ASX shares, particularly with franking credits boosting the after-tax return, that portion alone could be generating somewhere in the range of $10,000 to $15,000 a year without a single asset being sold. This is the version of $1 million that starts to genuinely change how someone experiences money day to day. Version 3, the super heavy millionaire, usually someone later in their career who has spent decades maximizing contributions and letting compounding do the work inside a concessionally taxed environment. Maybe $700,000 or more sitting in super, plus a paid-off or nearly paid-off home. This person often has enormous long-term security but very little accessible cash before preservation age, which creates its own strange tension. Rich on paper, restricted in practice, at least until they're old enough to touch it. Now here's what actually changes once you cross $1 million in net worth, and what genuinely doesn't. What changes is the machinery underneath your finances starts working at a scale that's actually noticeable. A 7% return on $1 million illion is $70,000 a year in growth, compounding without a single extra dollar of effort. At $200,000 net worth, that same 7% is $14,000. The math doesn't just add up faster, it starts to feel like it's carrying real weight of its own. This is the stage where a lot of people describe something shifting psychologically. Money stops being something you're constantly managing under pressure and starts becoming something you're stewarding with a bit more room to breathe. What doesn't change, and this catches almost everyone off guard, is the feeling of being rich. Multiple studies on wealth perception in Australia have found the same pattern again and again. Only a tiny fraction of Australians, often cited around 1.4%, are willing to describe themselves as upper class, even when their actual financial position would suggest otherwise. Why? Because wealth is relative, and the moment you cross into a new financial tier, you start comparing yourself to the next one up instead of appreciating the one you just reached. Someone with $1 million starts noticing friends with investment properties and a paid-off holiday house, and suddenly their own position feels ordinary, even though by national standards it's genuinely strong. There's also a very specific trap that tends to appear right around this level, and it's worth naming directly. Lifestyle expansion disguised as reward. You've worked hard, you've hit a real milestone, and it feels justified to finally loosen the reins a little. A better car, a renovation, more frequent overseas trips because, well, you can afford it now. And technically, you can. But this is exactly the point where a lot of people's net worth growth quietly plateaus, not because their investments underperformed, but because the gap between what they earn and what they spend narrows just as their capital base gets large enough to really start compounding. The people who keep growing wealth past this point are almost always the ones who treat the milestone as fuel rather than a finish line. So what should someone actually do once they've crossed the $1 million mark? The first move is the same one that matters at every level. Know your composition. How much of that million is locked in property? How much is inaccessible inside super? And how much is genuinely liquid and working for you right now? This single distinction determines whether your $1 million gives you options today or simply gives you security decades from now. The second move is starting to think seriously about tax structure, because at this scale, inefficiency gets expensive fast. Salary sacrificing into super at a 15% tax rate instead of your marginal rate, using the carry-forward concessional cap rules if you're eligible, and thinking about whether investments sit inside or outside super all start to make a measurable difference in how quickly the next million builds, or doesn't. The third move is protecting the gap. Somewhere around this level, people who've been disciplined for years start to relax, and that relaxation is often where the real compounding stops. The exact same principle that got someone from 0 to $1 million, spending meaningfully less than they earn and investing the difference, is the same principle that takes them from 1 million to 2. Nothing about the formula changes just because the number got bigger. Here's the real takeaway. $1 million in net worth in Australia today isn't the fantasy it once was, and it isn't nothing either. It's a genuine structural shift, the point where compounding starts to carry real, visible weight. But it's rarely the feeling of arrival people expect. Whether it feels like wealth or feels like just another Tuesday depends almost entirely on how that million is built, how liquid it is, and whether the habits that built it are still intact. The number gets people to the milestone. The behavior is what determines what happens next. If this gave you a clearer picture of what wealth actually looks like at this level, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.